The white mist descended like a curtain falling on the world, thick and impenetrable, swallowing the valley whole, and through it walked the Homu Heretus, the wandering people. 23 souls moving in silence through the frozen landscape as they had for generations. They were nomads of the ancient northern lands, followers of migration routes carved by their ancestors over centuries, people who read the ice like others read books and understood the language of wind and snow. But this winter was different. The mist had come early, thicker than anyone could remember, and with it came a cold that penetrated bone and spirit alike. Marcus led them, as his father had before him, carrying the responsibility of the tribe on shoulders that had grown strong from years of walking these frozen paths. Behind him walked his wife, Elena, their 3 children, and the others who made up their small wandering community, all of them trusting that he would guide them through the white blindness to the winter camp their people had used for countless generations. Marcus stopped and held up his hand, and immediately the line behind him halted. The mist was so thick he could barely see 10 feet ahead. They were in a valley. He knew that from the way sound echoed off invisible walls and from the slope of the ground beneath his feet. But which valley? The landmarks he normally used for navigation were completely obscured. He turned to look back at his people, their forms ghostly in the white fog, and saw the trust in their eyes mixed with growing concern. Elena moved up beside him, her hand finding his in the way of people long married. "Do you know where we are?" she asked quietly. Marcus wanted to lie, to reassure her with false confidence, but the Homu Heretus did not lie to each other. Lies in this environment meant death. "Not precisely," he admitted, "but the valley runs north-south. If we follow it north, we should reach the junction where the old standing stones mark the path to winter camp." "Should," Elena repeated. It wasn't a question or a criticism, just an acknowledgement of uncertainty. Marcus squeezed her hand. "We keep moving. Standing still in this cold is not an option." She nodded and returned to her position, walking beside their eldest daughter, Anna, who was carrying the youngest child, little Thomas, wrapped in furs against her back. Could they trust the valley to lead them true, or had the mist disoriented them completely? The Homu Heretus began moving again, their footsteps muffled by snow and fog. They walked in their traditional formation, the strongest at front and back, children and elderly protected in the middle, everyone connected by ropes tied around their waists so no one could be lost in the whiteness. It was an old safety measure, passed down through generations, and Marcus was grateful for the wisdom of his ancestors. Behind Marcus walked old Peter, who at 73 was the eldest of their group and the keeper of their oral histories. Peter had walked these routes for over 60 years and knew every rock and tree and turn. But even Peter seemed uncertain in this mist. "Never seen fog like this," he muttered to Marcus during one brief pause. "It's not natural. Feels wrong." Marcus didn't disagree, but he kept his concerns private. The Homu Heretus were not superstitious people. Their survival depended on practical knowledge and clear thinking. But there was something uncanny about this mist, the way it seemed to press in on them, the way it deadened all sound except their own movements. It felt alive somehow, watchful. The group included several families. There was George and his wife Martha with their 2 teenage sons, strong boys who helped carry supplies. There was young widow Sarah with her daughter Emma, both of them still grieving the loss of Sarah's husband to a hunting accident the previous spring. There was David, the craftsman, his hands skilled at making the tools and weapons they needed to survive. There was Catherine and her elderly mother, Rose, who despite her age insisted on walking rather than being carried. And there were others, each person essential to the survival of the whole, each carrying knowledge and skills passed down through generations of wandering. They had been walking for 3 hours when Marcus realized they should have reached some recognizable landmark by now. The valley seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, unchanging, the walls invisible but sensed somewhere in the whiteness. He felt a cold knot of worry forming in his stomach. Had they somehow taken a wrong turn? Was this even the right valley? What if they were lost, truly lost, in terrain that could kill them within days? Marcus called another halt and gathered the group's most experienced members for a brief council. Old Peter, George, David, and Elena joined him, and they spoke in low voices. "We should have reached the split by now," George said, voicing what they were all thinking. "Either we're moving slower than expected, or we're in the wrong valley." David pulled out their map, though it was nearly useless in these conditions. The map was made of caribou hide, marked with routes and landmarks accumulated over generations. "If we're in the wrong valley, there are only 2 possibilities," he said, tracing paths with his finger. "We could be in the western valley, which leads to the cliffs,
Or we could be in the eastern valley, which eventually opens onto the frozen lake. Neither option was good. The cliffs were impassable, and the frozen lake was dangerous to cross without careful preparation. Elena looked at Marcus. "What do you think we should do?" Marcus studied the map, though he had it memorized. The Homu Heretus leaders were trained from childhood to navigate these lands, but training didn't help when all the landmarks were invisible.
We continue north, he decided. If we're in the western valley, we'll reach the cliffs and can backtrack. If we're in the eastern valley, we'll reach the lake. Either way, we'll know where we are. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was better than standing still or trying to climb out of the valley in zero visibility. The others nodded agreement, and they returned to their positions. Marcus noticed that several of the children were showing signs of cold stress, blue lips, shivering, slower movements. They needed to make camp soon, needed to get fires going and warm food into everyone. But making camp in this mist was dangerous. Without visibility, they couldn't properly assess the terrain or spot potential hazards. As they walked, Marcus thought about the stories old Peter told, legends of the Homu Heretus from centuries past. There were tales of groups who had been caught in similar fogs, some who had survived through cleverness and luck, others who had vanished completely, their fates unknown. Marcus had always thought these were just stories, cautionary tales to teach navigation skills. Now he wasn't so sure. The afternoon wore on, though it was impossible to tell the sun's position through the mist. Time became elastic, uncertain. They walked and walked, the valley seemingly endless. Marcus's legs ached, and he knew the others must be exhausted. Little Thomas had begun to cry, a thin wail that cut through the deadened air. Anna tried to soothe him, but the child was cold and hungry and frightened. Finally, Marcus made the decision to camp. They had passed a cluster of rocks that would provide some windbreak, and his instincts told him they couldn't push any further today. The group gathered in the lee of the rocks, and the men immediately began the work of making camp while the women tended to the children and elderly. Would a fire be safe, or would the smoke simply trap them in their own camp? George and his sons gathered what wood they could find, dead branches from stunted pines, dried grass, anything that would burn. David prepared the fire pit, arranging stones in the traditional way. Marcus used his flint and steel to strike sparks, and after many attempts, they got a small fire going. The flames were almost invisible in the white mist, but the heat was real and desperately needed. Everyone gathered close to the fire, hands stretched toward warmth. Elena distributed what food they had: dried meat, some hard bread, melted snow for water. The portions were small, but no one complained. The Homu Heretus were accustomed to making do with little. They ate in silence, too tired for conversation, each person lost in their own thoughts. As darkness fell, or what passed for darkness in the mist, Marcus organized watches. He would take the first shift, George the second, David the third. They couldn't let the fire go out, and they needed to stay alert for any changes in conditions.
The others rolled themselves in their furs and blankets, huddling together for warmth. Marcus sat by the fire, feeding it carefully, listening to the breathing of his sleeping people. He could hear little Thomas's congested sniffles, old Rose's labored breath, the occasional cough from Peter. These were his people, his responsibility. His father had entrusted them to him on his deathbed 3 years ago, had made Marcus promise to keep them safe, to maintain the old ways, to lead them on the ancient paths. But what if he couldn't? What if this was the journey where the Homu Heretus finally met their end? The thought was unbearable, but he couldn't push it away. They were lost in freezing fog, with limited supplies and no clear path forward. The odds were not good. Elena woke during his watch and came to sit beside him. She didn't ask how he was. She could read him too well for pretense. Instead, she simply sat close, her presence a comfort. After a while, she said softly, "Tell me about the winter camp. Remind me what we're walking toward." Marcus smiled, despite his worry. Elena knew the winter camp as well as he did, but she understood he needed to think about it, to hold the destination in his mind. "It's in a valley protected from the worst winds," he began. "There are caves where we store supplies, where we can shelter during the hardest storms. There's a stream that never fully freezes, where we can get fresh water. There are pine forests for wood and hunting grounds where the caribou pass through." Could they reach this paradise, or would it remain forever beyond their grasp?
The caves have paintings, Elena added, taking up the description. Made by our ancestors hundreds of years ago. Images of the first Homu Heretus, the hunting scenes, the sacred symbols. When we reach the caves, we add our own marks, continuing the tradition. She paused. I want Anna to make her first mark this year. She's old enough now. Marcus put his arm around his wife. Anna was 15, approaching the age when she would be considered an adult among their people. Making our mark in the caves would be a significant milestone. She will, Marcus said firmly. We'll get there, I promise. He hoped it was a promise he could keep. George relieved him at midnight, and Marcus went to lie down beside his family. Anna was curled around little Thomas, keeping him warm. His middle child, Daniel, slept with the abandon of a 10-year-old boy who had walked all day. Elena made space for Marcus, and he settled in, feeling exhaustion pull at him. But sleep was long in coming. He lay awake, staring up into the white mist that was somehow visible even in darkness, and prayed to whatever forces governed this harsh land to guide them safely. Morning brought no improvement in visibility. If anything, the mist seemed thicker. They ate a cold breakfast. They couldn't spare the wood for a morning fire, and prepared to move.
Several people were coughing now, and old Rose seemed particularly weak. Catherine helped her mother stand, but the elderly woman was unsteady on her feet. Marcus made a decision that he knew would be controversial. We need to pick up the pace, he announced. I know everyone is tired, but we can't afford to move slowly. We need to find our bearings and reach winter camp as quickly as possible. He saw concern on several faces, but no one argued. They all understood the reality of their situation. They set out at a faster pace, and immediately the strain showed. The children struggled to keep up. Rose began falling behind almost at once. But Marcus held firm, knowing that pushing now might save them later. They couldn't coddle weakness when survival was at stake. It was a harsh philosophy, but the Homo Heretus had survived for centuries by being realistic about what it took to live in these lands. By midday, they reached something that Marcus's heart sank, a cliff face emerging from the mist. They were in the western valley, the one that led nowhere. They had walked for a day and a half in the wrong direction. The realization was crushing. Marcus stood before the impassable stone wall and felt the weight of his failure pressing down on him. Had he led his people to their doom? The group gathered behind him, looking at the cliff that blocked their path. No one spoke, but Marcus could feel their fear, their disappointment. He was their leader, and he had led them astray. Elena came to stand beside him, her hand on his arm. It's not your fault, she said quietly. The mist fooled us all. Marcus wanted to believe that, but leadership meant accepting responsibility. He turned to face his people. We backtrack, he said. We return to where we made our first camp and find the correct valley. It will cost us time and energy, but we have no other choice. He waited for arguments, for complaints, but the Homu Heretus simply nodded and prepared to turn around. The journey back was harder than the journey forward. Everyone was tired, supplies were lower, and the knowledge that they had wasted precious time weighed on them. Rose collapsed an hour into the return trek. She simply sat down in the snow and refused to get up. Catherine pleaded with her mother, tried to help her stand, but Rose shook her head. I'm done, daughter, Rose said calmly. I've walked enough. I'm staying here. Catherine began to cry, but Rose was firm. You go on. Don't waste time on an old woman. I've lived a good life. I've walked these valleys for 80 years. This is where my journey ends. Marcus knelt beside Rose. We can carry you, he offered, though he knew they really couldn't. Rose smiled kindly. No, you can't, and we both know it. The Homo Heretus leave their elderly when the time comes. It's our way. My time has come. She looked at Catherine. Make your mark in the caves for me. Tell your children about their grandmother who loved to walk.
The group stood in respectful silence as Catherine said goodbye to her mother. Then, because there was no other choice, they walked away. Catherine sobbed as they left Rose sitting peacefully in the snow, wrapped in her furs, facing north toward the winter camp she would never see. It was one of the hardest moments of Marcus's life, but he knew Rose was right. The Homo Heretus could not afford sentiment when survival was at stake. Would they have to make more such terrible choices before they reached safety? They walked through the afternoon, retracing their steps. Marcus recognized landmarks he had seen on the outward journey, a distinctively shaped rock, a dead tree, the place where they had made their first camp. When they reached the spot where Marcus believed they had entered the wrong valley, he stopped and studied the terrain carefully. The problem was clear now.
In the mist, he had missed a subtle fork in the valley. The left path led west to the cliffs. The right path led northeast toward the lake, and beyond it to the winter camp. It was an easy mistake to make in zero visibility, but it had cost them dearly. "This way," Marcus said, leading them onto the correct path. The group followed without question, though he could see exhaustion in every face. They had been walking for 3 days now, had lost rows, and were running dangerously low on food. If they didn't reach the winter camp soon, more would die. As night approached, they made camp again. This time they had even less wood for the fire, and the temperature was dropping. Marcus could see frost forming on people's clothing, ice crystals growing in beards and hair. David organized the children into a tight group, all of them huddled together under whatever coverings they had. The adults sat around them in a protective circle. Old Peter led them in the traditional evening songs, the ancient melodies of the Homu Heretus that had been sung for generations. The songs told of long walks and safe arrivals, of ancestors who had endured and survived, of the eternal cycle of wandering that defined their people. Marcus sang along, finding comfort in the familiar words, drawing strength from the connection to all those who had walked these paths before. But during the night, David woke Marcus with urgent news. "Peter's not breathing," he said. Marcus went to the old man and found him cold and still, his face peaceful in death. Peter had simply slipped away in his sleep, his body finally surrendering to age and exhaustion. Marcus felt grief wash over him. Peter had been their historian, their connection to the past, the keeper of stories and knowledge. His loss was immeasurable. They wrapped Peter's body in his furs and left him by the rocks, unable to do more. There was no time for elaborate rituals, no possibility of carrying a body with them. The Homo Heretus honored their dead by continuing to walk, by surviving, by passing on the stories and traditions. Peter would understand.
He had prepared Marcus for leadership, knowing this day would come. How many more would they lose before this journey ended? The fourth day brought slightly better visibility. The mist was still thick, but Marcus could see perhaps 20 feet instead of 10. It was enough to make navigation easier, to spot landmarks he recognized from childhood journeys. His spirits lifted slightly. They were on the right path now. The lake should be less than a day ahead. But the improved visibility also revealed the toll the journey was taking. Sarah's daughter Emma had developed a bad cough that shook her small frame. George's eldest son, William, was limping badly from a twisted ankle. Martha's hands were severely frostbitten, the fingers black and useless. Everyone was thinner, weaker, moving with the mechanical determination of people running on empty. They walked through the morning and into the afternoon, driven by Marcus's insistence and their own desperate need to reach safety. And then, as the light began to fade, they saw it, the lake, a vast frozen expanse emerging from the mist. They had reached the first major landmark. They were close now, so close to the winter camp that Marcus could almost taste the safety of arrival. The group stood at the lake's edge, staring out at the ice. Marcus knew this lake well. It was 2 miles across at the narrowest point, and on the far side was the path to the winter camp. They could walk around the lake, which would take at least another full day, or they could cross the ice directly and reach the other side in a few hours. The safe choice was obvious, but his people were exhausted, supplies were gone, and night was approaching. Every hour mattered now. Marcus made a decision that he knew was risky but necessary. "We cross the ice tonight," he announced. "Carefully, together, we cross and reach the far side before dawn. By tomorrow evening, we'll be in the winter camp." Elena looked at him with concern. "Is the ice safe?" Marcus nodded. "It should be. The winter has been cold enough, and we're late in the season. The ice should be thick." He didn't mention the uncertainty, the possibility that warmer currents or spring-fed areas might have created weak spots. They didn't have the luxury of caution anymore. Would the ice hold, or would it become their grave? They rested for an hour at the lake's edge, gathering their strength. Marcus organized them in a line with 20 feet between each person, connected by ropes but spaced out so that if the ice broke under one, the others wouldn't be pulled down. It was standard practice for ice crossing, but it also meant they couldn't huddle together for warmth. As darkness fell completely, they began the crossing. Marcus went first, testing each step, listening for the creaks and groans that might warn of weakness. The ice seemed solid, responding with the dull thunk of thick winter ice under his feet.
Behind him, the others followed in a careful line, each person's life dependent on the strength of the frozen surface beneath them. The crossing was eerie. The mist hung over the ice like a ghost, and their footsteps echoed strangely in the cold air. Marcus couldn't see the far shore, couldn't see anything except the white ice immediately around him and the shadowy figures of his people strung out behind. He walked steadily, not too fast, not too slow, trusting his instincts and his knowledge of this lake. They were perhaps halfway across when Marcus heard it, a deep groaning sound coming from the ice below. He stopped immediately, holding up his hand. Everyone froze. The sound came again, a long, creaking groan that seemed to travel through the ice like a living thing. Marcus's heart pounded. Was the ice breaking up? Were they about to plunge into freezing water? For long moments they stood, absolutely still, hardly breathing. The groaning continued, but the ice held. Marcus realized these were normal sounds, the ice adjusting to temperature changes, expanding and contracting. Still dangerous, still terrifying, but not immediately fatal. He motioned for them to continue, moving even more carefully now. They had walked for perhaps another 20 minutes when disaster struck. Martha, whose frostbitten hands made it hard to balance, stepped onto a weak section of ice. There was a sharp crack, and suddenly she was falling, breaking through into the black water below. George screamed his wife's name and lunged forward, but the rope between them went taut, yanking him off his feet. Marcus ran back, sliding on the ice in his haste. He reached the hole where Martha had gone through and saw her hand clawing at the edge, her face white with shock as the freezing water pulled at her. George was crawling toward his wife, but Marcus knew they had only seconds. Water this cold would kill in minutes. Could they pull her out in time, or would the lake claim her? Marcus grabbed Martha's arm while George grabbed the other, and together they hauled her up onto the ice. She was gasping, her clothes already beginning to freeze, her body shaking uncontrollably. They had to get her warm immediately. Marcus stripped off his outer furs and wrapped them around Martha while David and the others rushed forward with more coverings. But they were in the middle of the lake with no shelter and no way to make a fire. Martha needed to get out of her wet clothes and into dry ones, needed heat to combat hypothermia. Marcus made a snap decision. "We run," he said. "We run for the far shore. Everyone as fast as you can safely move. We need to reach land and get a fire going." The group broke into an awkward run, supporting Martha between George and David, everyone pushing their exhausted bodies to move faster. The ice protested under their feet, creaking and groaning, but held.
Marcus led them forward, praying he was heading in the right direction, unable to see more than a few feet ahead. And then, miraculously, the shore emerged from the mist. They stumbled onto solid ground, and Marcus immediately set people to gathering wood, while he and George stripped Martha's frozen clothes off and wrapped her in every dry fur and blanket they had. David got a fire going with desperate speed, and they huddled Martha close to the flames. For an hour they worked to save her life, rubbing her limbs to restore circulation, forcing warm water between her lips, keeping the fire blazing. Gradually, color returned to her face, and her violent shivering eased. She would survive, but it had been desperately close. Another minute in the water, another few minutes without warmth, and they would have lost her. The group camped there on the shore, too exhausted to move further. They had crossed the lake and survived, but the cost had been high. Martha was alive, but weakened, possibly permanently damaged by her immersion, and they had burned through their last reserves of energy. Marcus looked at his people and saw the edges of defeat in some faces, the hollow-eyed stare of people who had endured too much. But they were close now, so close. One more day, perhaps less, and they would reach the winter camp. Marcus clung to that knowledge as he took his watch, feeding the fire, listening to the breathing of his sleeping people, and trying not to think about all the things that could still go wrong. Morning came gray and cold. The mist was finally beginning to lift, and Marcus could see hints of the landscape around them. They were at the north end of the lake, and ahead rose the low mountains that sheltered the winter camp. His heart lifted. He knew where they were now. He could navigate from here, even with his eyes closed. They were going to make it. He roused the group, and they ate the last scraps of their food. There was nothing left now, not even crumbs. They would reach the winter camp today, or they would starve. It was that simple. But Marcus could see determination in the faces around him. They had come too far, survived too much to give up now. They walked through the morning, following a path that climbed gradually into the foothills. The mist continued to thin, and patches of blue sky appeared overhead for the first time in days. Sunlight broke through in shafts, illuminating the snow-covered landscape. It was breathtakingly beautiful, and Marcus felt his spirits soar. The worst was over. They were going to make it. By midday, they crested a ridge, and there below them was the winter camp. Marcus stood looking down at the familiar valley, tears streaming down his face. He could see the caves, dark openings in the cliff face. He could see the pine forest and the stream, exactly as he had described it to Elena.
He could see the evidence of previous habitations, fire pits, stacked wood, the cleared areas where tents were traditionally pitched. Behind him, his people gathered on the ridge, and one by one they saw what he saw. There were tears, laughter, prayers of thanks. Elena put her arms around Marcus and held him tight. "You did it," she whispered. "You got us here." Marcus shook his head. "We did it, all of us together. We survived." The Homu Heretus descended into the winter camp with the last of their strength. They had walked for 5 days through impossible conditions, had lost 3 of their number, had endured cold and hunger and fear, but they had arrived. They had completed the migration that their ancestors had completed for countless generations. They had walked the ancient paths and survived. The next hours were a blur of activity. The men explored the caves and found the supply caches left from previous winters: dried meat, grain, tools, fuel. The women organized living spaces, getting children settled, preparing food. David got fires burning in several caves, and soon the smell of cooking filled the air. It was the most beautiful smell Marcus had ever experienced. Anna made her mark on the cave wall that evening, her hand trembling as she carved her symbol next to those of countless ancestors. Elena stood beside her daughter, proud and tearful. Marcus watched his family and felt overwhelming gratitude. They had survived. Against all odds, through terrible hardship, they had survived. That night, the Homu Heretus gathered in the largest cave, sitting around a blazing fire, eating their first real meal in days. Old Peter wasn't there to tell the traditional stories, but Marcus did his best to take on that role. He told about the journey they had just completed, honoring those they had lost: Rose, Peter, and coming so close to losing Martha. "The Homu Heretus have walked these paths for longer than memory," Marcus said, speaking words his father had taught him. "Every generation faces challenges. Every migration tests us. Some years the journey is easy, and we arrive with full bellies and light hearts. Other years, like this one, the journey demands everything we have. We pay the price in blood and tears and lives. But we endure. We survive. We continue walking." George stood up, his arm around Martha, who was recovering by the fire. "We honor those who didn't complete the journey," he said. "Rose, who walked for 80 years before she chose her resting place. Peter, who kept our stories alive and passed them to the next generation. They gave their lives so that we could be here, so that the Homu Heretus could continue." Father Benedict added his own blessing. "We walked through the valley of death and emerged on the other side," he said. "Not unscathed, not unchanged, but alive. That is the gift. That is what we must honor. The gift of life, the gift of survival, the gift of being able to walk another day."
The fire crackled and sparked, sending embers floating up toward the cave ceiling, where ancient paintings looked down at them. Marcus studied those paintings, images of hunters and travelers, of families and migrations. The Homo erectus had been making this journey for so long that its beginning was lost in myth. They would continue making it long after Marcus was gone, long after everyone in this cave had turned to dust. That was the gift they had preserved, not their own lives specifically, but the continuation of their people, their way of life, their ancient tradition of wandering. The mist had tested them, the cold had tried to kill them, the journey had demanded terrible sacrifices, but the Homo erectus endured. Over the following weeks, the survivors regained their strength. The winter camp provided everything they needed: shelter, food, water, wood for fires. The caves were warm and dry, the hunting was good, and slowly the trauma of the journey began to fade. Martha's frostbitten hands would never fully heal, but she adapted, learning to work with limited dexterity. Emma's cough gradually improved in the warmer, drier environment of the caves. David spent his days crafting new tools and weapons, replacing what had been lost or damaged during the journey. George and his sons explored the surrounding area, locating the caribou herds and planning hunting expeditions. Sarah and the other women prepared winter clothing, gathered firewood, and organized the living spaces. Everyone had work to do, responsibilities to fulfill. The Homo erectus survived by working together, each person contributing their skills. Anna thrived in the winter camp. She learned from the women how to cure hides, from the men how to read animal tracks, from Marcus how to navigate by stars. She was being prepared to lead someday, just as Marcus had been prepared. The knowledge of the Homo erectus was passed down through teaching and experience,
one generation preparing the next for the challenges they would face. One evening, Elena asked Marcus if he had any regrets about the journey. They were sitting outside their cave, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and pink. Marcus thought carefully before answering. "I regret the losses," he said finally. "Rose, Peter, the suffering we all endured. But I don't regret leading us here. We made the only choice possible. Stay and die slowly, or walk and have a chance at survival. We chose to walk." Elena nodded. "Catherine asked me today if she should have stayed with her mother, if she should have let Rose die alone." Marcus looked at his wife. "What did you tell her?" Elena smiled sadly. "I told her that Rose didn't die alone. She died surrounded by love, knowing her daughter would continue, knowing the Homu Erectus would survive. That's not dying alone. That's dying with purpose." Marcus took his wife's hand. "You're wise," he said. Elena laughed. "I'm practical."
Like all the women who have walked these paths before me, we understand what survival requires. We understand sacrifice. She paused, then added, "But I'm grateful we didn't have to sacrifice our children. When I think about little Thomas on Anna's back, or Daniel struggling to keep up, or Lucy, I'm grateful they made it." "So am I," Marcus said quietly. "The children were their future, the next generation of Homu lads who would walk these paths when Marcus and Elena were bones in the snow. That was the point of all the suffering, all the sacrifice, to give the children a future, to keep the ancient traditions alive." As winter deepened, life in the camp settled into comfortable rhythms. There were challenges, a particularly severe storm that kept them cave-bound for 3 days, a hunting accident that injured one of George's sons, a shortage of certain supplies that required careful rationing. But these were manageable problems, the normal difficulties of winter life. They were not the existential crisis of the migration through the mist. The Homu Heretus celebrated the winter solstice with traditional ceremonies. They lit fires on the high points around camp, sang the ancient songs, told the old stories. Marcus led the celebration, his voice carrying across the valley as he recited the migration history of their people. He included the recent journey in the recitation, ensuring it would be remembered, that Rose and Peter's names would be spoken by future generations. Catherine made a special effort to tell stories about her mother, sharing memories of Rose's long life, her wisdom, her humor, her love of walking. The Homu Heretus understood that the dead lived on in stories, that memory was the only immortality available to wandering people who left no permanent markers behind. Catherine's stories ensured that Rose would not be forgotten. As spring approached, Marcus began planning the summer migration. The Homu Heretus would leave the winter camp and travel to their summer grounds, following the caribou herds, fishing the rivers, gathering plants and berries. It was the eternal cycle, the rhythm that had sustained their people for generations. Walk in the autumn to winter camp, stay through the harsh months, walk in the spring to summer grounds, return in the autumn. Over and over, year after year, generation after generation. But Marcus knew he would approach the next migration differently. The journey through the mist had taught him important lessons about leadership, about the limits of human endurance, about the terrible choices sometimes necessary for survival. He would be more cautious, more careful, would listen more closely to the wisdom of the group rather than relying solely on his own judgment. Elena was already preparing for the spring journey, making sure everyone had good boots, adequate clothing, sufficient supplies. She had learned her own lessons about preparation and contingency planning.
They would not be caught unprepared again if they could help it, though the Homu Heretus understood that nature was ultimately unpredictable, that even the best preparations couldn't prevent all disasters. On a clear day in early spring, Marcus climbed to a high point above the camp and looked out at the landscape they would soon be crossing. The valleys and mountains stretched to the horizon, beautiful and deadly, the paths his people had walked for countless generations. Somewhere out there were the bodies of Rose and Peter, returned to the earth, their bones eventually to be scattered by animals and weather until nothing remained. Marcus said a prayer for them, a simple acknowledgement of their sacrifice, a promise to remember. Then he turned back toward the camp, toward the smoke rising from cooking fires, toward the sounds of children playing and adults working. This was what they had died for, this continuation of life, this persistence of the Homu Heretus in a harsh world that did not welcome their existence. The tribe prepared to leave the winter camp when the weather warmed and the rivers began to flow freely again.
They had spent nearly 6 months in the caves, and everyone was ready for movement, for the variety and challenges of the summer grounds. They packed up their belongings, cached supplies for the next winter, and said goodbye to the caves that had sheltered them. The journey to the summer grounds was blessedly uneventful. Clear skies, moderate temperatures, plenty of game to supplement their supplies. They moved at a comfortable pace, covering ground steadily without pushing to exhaustion. Anna walked with confidence now, no longer needing to be carried, taking pride in her growing strength and skill. When they reached the summer grounds, a series of valleys near a major river system, Marcus felt a deep satisfaction. He had completed the full cycle, had led his people through winter and now into summer. The Homu Heretus would spend the warm months here, would fish and hunt and gather, would prepare for the next winter, would continue their ancient way of life. One evening, as Marcus sat by the river watching the sunset, young Daniel came to sit beside him. "Papa," the boy said, "will we have to walk through mist again?" Marcus considered the question. "Maybe," he said honestly. "The world is unpredictable. We can't know what challenges we'll face, but we've learned how to survive the mist. We know what to do now." Daniel nodded, seeming satisfied with that answer. "I want to be a leader like you someday," he said. Marcus put his arm around his son. "Then you must learn everything you can. Watch, listen, remember. Leadership isn't about being brave or strong. It's about making good decisions and accepting responsibility for those decisions, whether they turn out well or poorly." "Were you responsible for the people who died?" Daniel asked with a child's directness. Marcus didn't shy away from the question. "Yes," he said.
I was responsible. I led them into the mist. I made the choices that resulted in their deaths. But I was also responsible for the 12 who survived. Leadership means accepting both outcomes, learning from mistakes, and continuing to lead with humility and care. Daniel thought about this for a long moment. "That sounds hard," he said finally. Marcus smiled. "It is hard, but it's also an honor. The Homu Heretus trust their leaders with their lives. That trust must be respected and protected." He looked at his son. "You'll understand better when you're older, and the responsibility falls to you." The summer passed in the timeless way of summers, days blending together in a pleasant rhythm of work and rest, hunting and gathering, storytelling and celebration. The Homu Heretus thrived in these conditions, their numbers gradually recovering from the losses of the previous winter. Sarah remarried, finding happiness with one of the younger men. New children were born, ensuring the continuation of the tribe. When autumn came, Marcus again faced the decision of when to begin the migration to winter camp. He was more cautious this time, waiting for better weather, ensuring everyone was well prepared, double-checking supplies and equipment. The memory of the mist journey informed every choice he made. The autumn migration went smoothly. No mist obscured their path, no disasters befell them. They reached the winter camp with minimal difficulty, arriving well before the harsh weather set in. As they settled into the familiar caves, Marcus felt profound relief. They had completed another cycle. The Homu Heretus continued. Years passed. Marcus grew older, his hair turning gray, his body bearing the marks of countless miles walked. Elena aged beside him, her face lined but her spirit still strong. Their children grew into adults, Anna especially showing the qualities of a leader. Daniel became an excellent hunter. Little Thomas, no longer so little, displayed the curiosity and intelligence that would make him their next storyteller. Marcus knew his time as leader was approaching its end. He had led the Homo Heretus for nearly 20 years, had guided them through good times and terrible ones, had made decisions that saved lives and decisions that cost lives. He had done his best, had honored his father's trust, had tried to be worthy of the responsibility placed on him. When he finally stepped down, passing leadership to Anna, Marcus felt both relief and sadness. He was no longer responsible for every decision, no longer bore the weight of the tribe's survival on his shoulders, but he also no longer had the same purpose, the same essential role. He was now one of the elders, a source of wisdom and experience, but not the primary decision-maker. Anna proved to be an excellent leader, perhaps even better than Marcus had been. She learned from his mistakes, built on his successes, and added her own innovations.
Under her guidance, the Homu Heretus continued to thrive, continued to walk the ancient paths, continued to maintain their way of life in a world that was changing around them. Marcus lived to be 73, the same age Peter had been when he died in the mist. In his final winter, Marcus spent long hours in the caves, looking at the ancient paintings,
tracing the marks left by generations of Homu Heretus. He found the mark Anna had made on her first visit, now weathered but still visible. Beside it were marks from Daniel and Thomas, and from the next generation of children. The continuity comforted him. The Homu Heretus would persist long after he was gone. The journey through the mist would become another story, told and retold, a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride and the importance of caution. Rose and Peter would be remembered, their names spoken with respect by people who had never met them. On a clear winter night, with Elena holding his hand and his children gathered around, Marcus died peacefully in his sleep. They gave him the traditional Homu Heretus funeral, wrapping his body in his finest furs and placing him in a small cave overlooking the winter camp. Anna spoke the words her father had taught her, honoring his life and leadership. "Marcus walked the paths of our ancestors," she said, her voice carrying to the assembled tribe. "He led us through darkness and mist, through trial and loss. Some journeys he completed successfully, guiding us to safety. Others cost us dearly, teaching us painful lessons. But he never stopped walking, never gave up, never abandoned his responsibility. That is the mark of a true leader of the Homu Heretus." Elena added her own words. "He was my husband for 50 years. We walked every path together. He gave me 3 beautiful children and a life of purpose. I will carry his memory until I join him in the next world." She placed her hand on Marcus's chest, a final gesture of love and farewell. The tribe sang the ancient songs, their voices echoing off the stone walls, carried by the wind across the valleys Marcus had walked so many times. Then they left him there, as was their tradition, and returned to the living world, to the work and joy and sorrow of continued existence. Elena lived another 2 years before joining her husband. Daniel became the tribe's historian, learning all the stories from Thomas and adding his own observations. Anna led the Homu Heretus for 30 years, guiding them through challenges and changes, always maintaining the core traditions while adapting to new realities. The story of the journey through the mist became one of the most frequently told tales around Homu Heretus campfires. It was a story of survival and sacrifice, of leadership and loss, of the terrible choices sometimes necessary for the continuation of a people. Each telling honored Rose and Peter, remembered their courage and their acceptance of death so that others might live.
And the Homu Heretus continued to walk, through valleys and over mountains, in sunshine and in mist, through seasons and years and generations. They walked because walking was their identity, their purpose, their connection to ancestors stretching back into the unknowable past. They walked because their survival depended on it. They walked because to stop walking would be to cease being the Homu Heretus. The ancient paths remained, worn by countless feet over countless years. The winter camp and summer grounds continued to shelter each new generation. The caves held layer upon layer of marks, a physical record of the tribe's persistence. And somewhere in a small cave overlooking the winter camp, Marcus's bones slowly returned to the earth, his life complete, his duty fulfilled. The mist came again in later years, as it always did, sometimes thick, sometimes thin, sometimes not at all. But the Homu Heretus had learned how to navigate it, had learned the lessons Marcus's generation had paid for with their lives. They carried those lessons forward, taught them to their children, ensured that future migrants would be better prepared for the challenges of their ancient journey. And so the story continues, as it has continued for generations beyond counting, as it will continue for generations yet to come. As the white mist closes the valley, the Homu Heretus walks silently through the frozen landscape, carrying their history on their backs, their future in their children, their identity in their endless journey. They walk because they are the wandering people, and wandering is not just what they do, it is who they are. The paths remain, the valleys remain, the mountains and rivers and forests remain. And through them all, in season after season, year after year, the Homu Heretus continue their ancient journey, walking the paths their ancestors walked, maintaining traditions older than memory, surviving through courage and sacrifice and the unbreakable bond of community. This is their story. This is their truth. This is their gift to the future. The knowledge that humans can endure almost anything, can survive impossible conditions, can persist in the face of loss and hardship and tragedy. The Homu Heretus walk on,
forever and always, the eternal wanderers of the frozen north, keepers of ancient wisdom, followers of paths that have no end. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the frozen valleys with the Homu Heretus. If this story of survival, sacrifice, and the unbreakable human spirit moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more tales like this one. We share stories of perseverance and endurance, of ancient peoples and their wisdom, of journeys that test the limits of human capability. Hit that subscribe button and walk with us through more incredible stories of survival. Until next time, stay warm, honor your ancestors, and remember, the journey continues as long as we keep walking forward.